What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so with the Logan movie coming out in the next few months or so, I was trying to figure out what kind of Wolverine content that I was gonna do, because I wanted to touch on to some Wolverine stuff, just because of the fact that I think there's a lot of great Wolverine stories out there, but I was like, if I'm gonna jump into it, I can't just jump into the middle of a Wolverine story. I can't just do like Wolverine kills Sabretooth. I mean, I'm sure you guys would love to see that, but you can't just like jump into that. You kind of have to work your way up to it. And so the idea was, all right, if we're gonna do that, then where do we start? Well, I mean, I was like, I could start with Wolverine's origin, I guess, but that's been done to death. Everyone has done Wolverine's origin, and you better believe when the movie starts coming out, they're gonna do his origin again. And so I was like, I may do that at some point along the line. But the one story that like no one's ever done is the story of how Wolverine got his adamantium skeleton. No one ever really talked about that. Now, this story came to us actually between March and September of 1991, and it was written by a guy named Barry Windsor Smith. One thing to keep in mind with this story though is that virtually nothing was known about Wolverine up to this point. And the reason why was because Wolverine, as he had been created by Chris Claremont and Len Wein, was really just designed to be this extremely intrinsic, mysterious character. He wasn't designed to have a great big huge grandiose backstory, but the fact that he was so mysterious is what made him so popular, because everybody wanted to know where these little fragments of memories were coming from. What in the world is Weapon X? What's Canada's Department K? How does all that kind of stuff come together to form the backstory of Wolverine? Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with his history, bear with me for a second while I kind of run over this for a lot of you guys who aren't. So in Marvel Comics, there have been a lot of retroactive continuities, meaning there have been writers that have come in and they basically changed the past by introducing new things and so on and so forth. The first major of these involving Wolverine came in 1992 with Chris Claremont and Jim Lee. And what they did is they introduced a group called Team X. And what they said was that Wolverine was part of this Black Ops group called Team X alongside Sabretooth, Silver Fox, and Maverick, I think. And they basically carried out these clandestine organizations for Canada's Department K, which was like their version of the CIA, which was funded by the United States CIA. And the reason why was because if all of this went south, if they were caught in a mission or something like that, or the mission was botched, all the blame would fall on Canada, and the United States could just walk away without having their hands caught in the cookie jar. What then happened is in 2001, this writer Grant Morrison came along, and Grant Morrison said, no, there's a lot more to it than that. There's this weird organism named John Sublime that came to the realization that mutants are immune to John Sublime's mind control, and so Sublime wanted to get rid of all the mutants. And so what it did is it said, we need to basically create super soldiers that can wipe out mutants. Captain America was the first one, but it was a program called Weapons Plus that was created using information gathered by Mr. Sinister during his weird experiments during World War II. But after Captain America's successful transition into the super soldier, but because of the fact that Dr. Abraham Erskine had died, John Sublime had to basically start from scratch. And so there was Weapons 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, landing ultimately with Weapon X, Weapon 10, which is where we got Wolverine. And then of course we got Deadpool with Weapon 11. Now, following this, Daniel Way came along in something like 2008, 2009, 2010, something like that, I can't remember. But he wrote a series of stories called Wolverine Origins. And what he came back and did is he basically said, all that John Sublime stuff is nonsense. There was just this guy named Ronan who was part of the Weapon X project. He basically spearheaded the whole thing, and he turned Logan into Wolverine. There's been a lot of retcons, a lot of changes, and a lot of it's really, really confusing. And so for the sake of this story, what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a clean slate, and we're just gonna more or less go with the idea that Barry Windsor Smith was going with, that we didn't know anything about Wolverine before this. And so essentially the entire comic in the beginning initially focuses on this kind of back and forth. It's like this montage, where Wolverine's giving us this monologue, but it's kind of jumping back and forth, of course, where Logan himself is being tracked by some really shady cloak and dagger kind of guys. But we also have a guy named Abraham Cornelius who's looking over various phone numbers, who's making various phone calls. We have the guy, Professor Truitt, who's bringing on Carol Hines. It's really kind of setting the stage for what will become this Weapon X project. Now, Wolverine was not their first attempt to bond adamantium to the skeleton of a human being. Instead, they had done it in several different places. They'd done it on monkeys, they'd done it on actual regular people, but all of them were failures. For whatever reason, they were just grotesque failures. But the most common reason for why it didn't work is because their bodies just couldn't handle the adamantium process. Their bodies would basically just shut down because it was too much, the body couldn't recover from the extensive injuries that came about with metal being grafted to the human skeleton. And so because of that, basically all of them died. And so again, it was really just continuing the process of just running around and snatching people. And so again, because of the fact that Windsor Smith was going with the idea that nothing was known about Logan, and the idea that the Professor Truitt, that Dr. Cornelius, that Carol Hines, the fact they didn't know that Logan had a healing factor meant that when they grabbed him, it was just sheer luck that it happened to work out. But of course, when he's taken under, You know, he's immediately stripped of all of his clothes, he's shaved in his entirety, and he's just simply hooked up to a whole bunch of tubes and everything. So again, a lot of this is kind of going back and forth, but there are a little spotty references here and there that Windsor Smith makes to the idea that Wolverine had a healing factor and nobody knew. The first and most notable of these is that when he's shot with a tranquilizer, he recovers pretty fast. Now, ultimately, they just kind of have to take him out the old-fashioned way and just, you know, knock him out with brute force. But when he's taken to the Weapon X facility, again, it's just this great big huge experimentation, and all it is for a lot of this is really just kind of bonding him with adamantium, sending the adamantium in, and they're doing it in stages. And the reason for this is because adamantium is quite literally just a liquid metal. If they were to throw it all into his body at one time, there's no telling what would happen. It could simply be that there's just too much for it all to graft at one time, and so he's just got adamantium floating in his veins and his body just kind of gets ripped apart at the seams. But the idea here is that once it sets, it'll harden and become the strongest metal on the face of the planet. Now, to talk about this for a second, because I imagine a lot of people have questions about like adamantium, one of the most common questions that I see is like, which one's stronger, adamantium or vibranium? Now, we've talked about this before, but it can never hurt to rehash an interesting question like this. So in the realm of Marvel Comics, you have all different kinds of metals, but the three most popular, or I guess the three most durable, are Uru metal, adamantium, and then vibranium. Vibranium is literally just some material that came from space somewhere. Nobody really knows where it came from. It landed on Earth. It was discovered by primitive Wakandans who viewed it as their honor, I guess their job, according to the Panther god Bast, to basically guard the adamantium. The first, or I guess the greatest of these Wakandans was bestowed with the powers of the Panther god Bast, becoming the first Black Panther. Another part of vibranium landed in Antarctica, and it gave it a whole different set of properties. And so Wakandan vibranium basically has the ability to manipulate energy, absorb sound, different things like that, and then use those sound waves that have been absorbed to essentially make it more durable. Antarctic vibranium literally just breaks down objects and substances on the molecular level. And so it's like the ultimate knife is really kind of the best way to think about it. Uru metal is an enchanted metal from one of the realms of Asgard, but the metal can be enchanted more so than it normally is to basically absorb magical energy. That's the kind of metal that you find in Thor's hammer. That's why like Doctor Strange's magic doesn't work on Thor, because if he were to try to use it, Thor would just absorb the magic with his hammer. It would make the hammer stronger, and then Doctor Strange would probably get his head knocked off. Finally, when it comes to adamantium, there's several different types. There's true adamantium, there is regular adamantium, then there's false adamantium, which is what you find with carbonadium, which is basically like Russia's cheap version of adamantium. The true adamantium was discovered by accident. In Marvel Comics, what had happened was when Captain America had been presented with a shield by the Wakandans after helping to fight off the Nazi party, or I guess Nazi soldiers, during World War II, not only did he witness how aerodynamic their shields were because they were round, but he was also presented with a small piece of vibranium by the Wakandan king. And so what Captain America did is he came back to the United States, he commissioned the US government to create a new shield which was round, and then make that shield out of vibranium. The issue was that the professor, and I want to say his name was Professor Smith, the metallurgist who was putting the shield together, had basically fallen asleep at the wheel. And in the process, some chemicals got mixed in, which I think it was actually iron and a couple other things, and it resulted in this weird hybrid metal compound, which is why Captain America's shield is the only thing stronger than adamantium. But in the process of trying to duplicate the material that makes up Captain America's shield, this guy accidentally discovered adamantium. That's what's called true adamantium. And I believe that the bones, or I guess the skeleton of Wolverine, maybe the claws of Sabretooth, there's maybe like one or two, maybe three people that actually have true adamantium. Everything else is just a cheap knockoff. It's everybody else's attempt to try to duplicate adamantium. But that's more or less kind of how that works in the realm of Marvel Comics. But what Wolverine is getting right here is real, tried and true, legitimate adamantium. But again, you know, once adamantium hardens, it's impossible to destroy it. You can't take it apart. You can't do anything with it. It's impossible to destroy. I think that the only instance where it's really been like dented or damaged in any real way was when Thor started beating on adamantium with his hammer, and it dented it a little bit, but it didn't like tear a hole in it or anything along those lines. But the fact remains here that because of the fact that Wolverine is literally recovering from the adamantium bonding process far faster than he should be, this begins to raise questions among Carol Hines and the professor and Dr. Abraham Cornelius. Now, the professor basically vacates, and it's kind of left mysterious as to why, but we basically find out that he's talking to a third party. We don't know who that person is, but he's talking to them, and what he reveals is that the professor himself did not know that Logan was a mutant. He did not know that Logan had an instantaneous healing factor, and so they're all learning about this for the first time. But this
this is also a blessing in disguise because it makes Logan the perfect host for adamantium, because as the adamantium goes into his body, as it tries to burn away at the bones because it's so incredibly hot, the bones will just begin to heal themselves at a rapid pace. As it starts to melt through the skin because it's so hot, the skin will heal at a rapid pace. And so once the cooling process happens and the adamantium bonds to the bones, it'll be perfect. It'll be a perfect example of a person who successfully had adamantium bonded to their skeleton. The problem with this is that Wolverine, with his healing factor, is also beginning to emerge, is also beginning to somewhat come to. Now, initially, when he begins to sort of wake up, he doesn't actually attack everybody. Instead, what happens is Professor Truitt is actually met from some young intern who's basically in the lab keeping an eye on Wolverine while Cornelius and Hines are not there. And he basically says that Wolverine's waking up and he's looking at his hands. Now, this is the first time that we actually get any indication of Wolverine's claws popping. And that's why people said for the longest time that Wolverine didn't have claws until he received adamantium bonding. We learned more recently in the Wolverine origin story that Wolverine always had claws and they were made of bone. That's why it was such a huge revelation in Fatal Attractions when Wolverine had the adamantium torn from his body and then he popped his claws and he had bone claws. That also was why we ended up getting Feral Wolverine, where he was just a crazy guy living in the woods and just attacking everything that he saw. It was actually kind of a really cool series of stories. I think there were a line of comics based on that. I think it was like Savage Wolverine. But the fact remains here that when these claws pop, again, they're adamantium. In response to this, Professor Truitt actually tells that intern kid, go in there, see what's going on, investigate, make sure you shut the security door behind you in case anything happens. Now, following this, of course, we have Abraham Cornelius, and he grabs a couple of guards with him to basically go into the lab and see what's going on due to the alarms. And when they get in there, Wolverine had essentially killed this guy. And so as this volume, this first, little section starts to come to a close, it's really just the idea that Wolverine has effectively come to. And so what'll happen next is, the final stages of adamantium bonding, followed by what is essentially the most torturous aspect of this story, where Wolverine is forced to receive false memories and then trained to become a killing machine. But with that being said, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained and you guys enjoy videos like this, then make sure you hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps, and leave a like if you guys thought this was kind of cool, and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you all later. Peace.